You have probably been told that brokenheartedness is something to get through quickly, fix, or hide so you can return to normal. Psalm 34:18 says something almost backwards from that instinct. The New King James Version puts it this way: "The Lord is near to those who have a broken heart and saves such as have a contrite spirit." Two different kinds of pain, named side by side in a single sentence. Most readers skim past that as repetition, the same idea said twice for effect. It is not repetition. It is two distinct wounds, and the difference matters more than most sermons on this verse ever say out loud. The verse just before it sets up why this matters. The righteous cry, and the Lord hears. Not the righteous compose themselves quietly, and the Lord notices their dignity. The crying comes first, and it is heard. Look first at who wrote this and what he had just survived. The heading over Psalm 34 says David wrote it after he feigned madness before Abimelech. He had fled Saul's court with nothing, run to the one place he thought might shelter him, realized he had walked into a den of enemies, and pretended to be insane to escape with his life. He drooled on his own beard. He scratched at the gate like an animal. He survived a death threat by performing the collapse of his own mind in front of people who already despised him. Afterward, he hid in a cave. The text says everyone in distress, everyone in debt, everyone discouraged gathered around him there, not a congregation of the composed. People running from creditors, from danger, from their own failures, with no resume of faith to offer God in exchange for his attention. If you have ever felt you needed to clean yourself up before you were presentable enough to pray, this is the room this psalm was written in. You did not need an invitation to that cave. You just needed to be desperate enough to show up. That is still true of the nearness this psalm describes. It was never reserved for people who had already pulled themselves together. So when David says the Lord is near, start with that one word. The Hebrew underneath it is qarob, and it is not a soft, poetic flourish. Qarob is a measurable proximity term, the same root used for a close relative, a kinsman near enough to redeem family property or stand in for you in a legal dispute. When the text says God is near to the brokenhearted, it is describing literal, locatable closeness, the kind you could point to and say, there, that close. Not sympathy from a distance. From here, we will simply call it nearness. Picture the closest house on your street, near enough to call out from your own porch and be heard. That is the kind of word this is. Not a sentiment floating somewhere above you, but a location you could walk to. This cuts against the quiet belief most wounded people carry without ever saying it out loud. That brokenness pushes God further away, that if you were stronger or more composed, he would be closer. Psalm 34:18 reverses that completely. It does not say God is near to the composed. It says he is near to the brokenhearted, specifically, by name, as if brokenness itself is the address he goes to. The very condition you assume disqualifies you from his presence is the condition the verse names as his exact location. Now look at the first wound named in the verse. The Hebrew behind broken heart is shabar, the same violent word used elsewhere for shattering pottery and splintering bone. It is paired with lev, heart, and lev in Hebrew is not mainly the seat of feeling. It is the seat of will, decision, and direction, the part of you that chooses where you are even walking. A shattered heart, in this language, is not just a person who feels sad. It is a person whose internal compass is in pieces, who has lost the ability to know which way they are even supposed to be facing. If you have ever stood in a grocery aisle, unable to choose what to make for dinner, unable to remember what you even like anymore, that is not a small thing. That is exactly the condition this word names. If you have ever sat in a season where you could not make a basic decision, could not name what you wanted, could not locate your own sense of direction, that is not weakness either. From here, we will simply call it the break. A widow standing in her kitchen, unable to decide what to cook for one person instead of two. A man staring at his closet, unable to choose a shirt, not because the choice is hard, but because nothing in him can locate a preference anymore. That is the break, doing exactly what it does. The second wound is different, and pastorally it might matter even more. The Hebrew behind contrite spirit is daka, the specific term for grinding grain into flour and crushing incense to powder for the altar. A broken object snaps in one moment. A crushed object is ground down slowly, repeatedly, under sustained pressure, until what is left is no longer a shape at all but a fine, formless residue. Picture grain under a millstone, struck again and again, not once. No single blow could be pointed to and blamed. The damage is the accumulation, not an event. From here, we will simply call it the crushing. The same word describes incense crushed to powder before it could be burned on the altar. The crushing there was not waste. It was preparation, the very thing that let the incense rise as something fragrant instead of staying a solid, unusable lump. Hold that detail. We will return to it. The break is the heart that cracked in a single blow, a diagnosis, a betrayal, a death, a moment you could mark on a calendar. The crushing is the slow erosion of years with no single event to point to. This is the distinction most counseling conversations skip. So many people carrying a slow, crushing quietly assume their pain does not count, since there is no single wound they can name. A marriage that slowly went cold instead of ending in one dramatic scene. A body that slowly stopped cooperating, year after year, instead of one diagnosis day. A calling that slowly stopped feeling like calling. A long season of infertility with no single failed attempt to blame, just years of it. A long season caring for someone else, with no single hard day, just thousands of ordinary ones that wore you down together. The verse names that condition specifically and puts it in the same sentence as the sudden break, promising it the same nearness and the same rescue. You do not need a dramatic wound to qualify. Slow grinding counts. This same pairing shows up again in Psalm 51, David's prayer after his failure with Bathsheba was exposed. He tells God that a broken and a contrite heart, the very same two words, is the sacrifice God actually wants. Notice the contrast. Psalm 34 was written while running for his life. Psalm 51 was written after his own sin was exposed. Two very different seasons, the same pair of words both times. That repetition tells you these were not a poetic accident. David kept returning to this exact pair because he kept living in both conditions, sometimes within the very same year of his life. Quick pause here, because naming this distinction carefully, instead of flattening it into one idea, takes real time to dig out of the text properly. If that kind of study is valuable to you, becoming a channel member is what keeps this research possible. If you already support this channel, thank you. This is exactly the work your support makes room for. The verse does not stop at naming the wound. It promises rescue. The Hebrew behind saves is yasha, the same root behind the name Jesus, Yeshua. Yasha is the language of being physically pulled from danger, the word used when someone is dragged out of drowning water or delivered from an army that had them surrounded. God does not look at the crushing from a distance and offer encouragement. The word says he reaches in and pulls out. From here, we will simply call it rescue. This is exactly where well-meaning comfort goes wrong, and it is worth naming plainly, because most of us have done this to someone else without realizing it. Someone is sitting in a fresh break or a long crushing, and the first thing offered to them is a verse about purpose, everything working together for good, before the wound has even been allowed to be named out loud. That instinct usually comes from love, a desire to get the hurting person to the other side of the pain as fast as possible. But Psalm 34:18 does not do that. It sounds like, well, God works all things together for good, said within the first hour of someone's worst day. It is true, eventually. Said too soon, it functions less like comfort and more like an exit ramp away from sitting with someone in what they are actually feeling. It does not rush past the break and the crushing to get to a tidy resolution. It simply states that God is near, exactly as the person is, in the middle of exactly what they are in. The comfort is the nearness itself, not a forecast of how things will eventually make sense. If you have ever felt talked past in your grief, this verse is quietly correcting that instinct. So here is what processing this verse actually looks like this week. Start by naming which condition fits you right now, the break or the crushing, out loud, even if only to yourself. Then practice noticing nearness in small, embodied ways instead of waiting for a dramatic spiritual sensation. A held breath let out slowly. A hand placed flat on your own chest. Say one true sentence to God, even if the sentence is simply, "I do not feel you," but the verse says you are here. Nearness that is true does not always feel emotionally vivid. If you are carrying a clear break, write down the actual moment, the date if you know it, the sentence someone said. Naming the specific break is not reopening it for no reason. It is refusing to let it stay vague. If you are carrying a slow crushing, the exercise is different. Instead of hunting for one moment to blame, name the pattern instead. What has been wearing you down? Repeated disappointment, repeated waiting, repeated small losses. Bringing a pattern to God in prayer is just as legitimate as bringing a single crisis. Many of the Psalms are written exactly this way, complaint laid out honestly before any resolution is offered. You are allowed to write your own version of that, a page that simply lists what has worn you down, with no tidy conclusion at the bottom. Lament is not a lesser form of prayer. It is the form this entire psalm was written in. In both cases, another person matters, not as a replacement for God's nearness, but as one of the ordinary ways it tends to show up in an ordinary week. A friend who will sit with a fresh break without rushing you past it. A counselor trained to recognize a slow crushing even when you cannot name why you are so tired. A small group willing to keep asking how you are doing weeks after the obvious crisis has passed, which matters most for the crushing, since slow grinding rarely gets the same attention a sudden break does. Churches are often better at the first few days of a break than at the long middle of a crushing. Casseroles show up after a funeral. They rarely show up in year 3 of a slow goodbye. Naming that gap out loud is not bitterness. It is the first step toward closing it. There is a reason this lands so fully in Christ. The same crushing language returns in Isaiah's description of the suffering servant, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, struck down and afflicted. It returns again in Gethsemane, where Jesus tells his disciples his soul is crushed with sorrow, the same pressure pressing in on him the night before the cross. The God who promises nearness to the crushed did not stay outside it. He walked into a crushing of his own, ground down by the full weight of what was coming. He did not skip past it to a brave, composed ending. He let it be named exactly as crushing, sweat and blood pressed out of him in a garden before anyone else saw what it cost. Then he was raised. The nearness promised to you was modeled first in his own body. He is not asking you to survive a crushing he never experienced himself. The very next verse in this psalm says many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. Not one affliction. Many. This was never written as a promise for a single hard season you simply push through once. And if you have tried the breath, the hand on your chest, the honest sentence and still feel nothing, that does not mean you did it wrong. Qarob was always a location, not a guaranteed feeling on command. You are allowed to trust the address even on the nights the lights look off. So if you are sitting in a clear break tonight, hear this plainly. He is not waiting at a distance for you to compose yourself before he comes closer. He is already near, already in the room. And if you are sitting in a slow crushing tonight, with no single name and no dramatic story to justify the exhaustion you feel, hear this just as plainly. Your pain still counts. Your nearness is not conditional on having a better explanation, and rescue is already reaching for whatever is left of you right now, even if what is left feels like flour. If this gave language to something you have been carrying without the right words for it, subscribe so we can keep digging into these texts together. Leave a comment, even one word, naming whether you are sitting in the break or the crushing tonight. It helps this reach someone else who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who has been grinding quietly for a long time with no single story to explain why. Whichever word fits you tonight, the break or the crushing, the same incense that was crushed to powder rose as something fragrant on the altar. That does not erase what the crushing cost. It simply means the crushing is not where your story ends. And may the God who is near to the brokenhearted meet you exactly where the breaking or the crushing has left you tonight. God bless you.